So, with Native American Heritage Month drawing to a close, I thought it would be beyond worth our time to explore just a few noteworthy Native American authors. Keep in mind that this is, more than anything, just a crash course. There are so many amazing authors from all Indigenous backgrounds, and every single one of them is worth reading. As such, this is not a comprehensive list, not even of the most famous or essential Native American authors. This video is mostly meant to serve as an introduction for those looking to know where they might start when it comes to fiction, nonfiction, and poetry by Native American authors. I cannot overstate how important Indigenous voices are to our study of American literature. As we're going to discuss in this video, Native peoples had their voices and stories stripped from them for far too long. Now more than ever, it's necessary that we recognize these talented storytellers and make sure their writings stay alive. We are living in what Kenneth Lincoln described as a Native American Renaissance, with more literature than ever being produced by Indigenous peoples of the United States, and we should feel fortunate for that. Now, I am not Native American, I am white. So if you believe anything I say here is out of pocket, then please, I invite you to educate me. I just encourage you to do so respectfully. But with these disclaimers out of the way, let's talk about some important Indigenous authors. The Native American author that you are perhaps most likely to have heard of is Sherman Alexie, born and raised to the Spokane tribe on the Spokane Reservation. However, it must be noted that we can't discuss Alexie anymore without discussing his many controversies, including the sexual harassment allegations against him. However, that doesn't mean his writings aren't worth considering. One thing my diversity in American literature professor had us consider was, to paraphrase her, being the poster person for any group is complicated. One must consider the costs and the pain when breaking through into new ground. Still, this does not excuse Alexie's crimes. Keeping all of that in mind, the odds are good that your school had you read Alexie's young adult book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and if not that book, then likely at least one of his short stories or poems. Alexie employs a great deal of irony in his writing, exploring stereotypes and Native American identity. When it comes to stereotypes, he attempts to point out who's saying what and to what end. Is the stereotype an intrinsic part of that character, or is it a reasonable reaction to a stimulus? Is the stereotype the only character trait, or is there more to it than that? Furthermore, as with many Native American authors, Alexie explores the link between Native peoples and education. From the 1600s to about the mid-1900s, Native American children were sent to Indian boarding schools. If you didn't know these existed, I wouldn't blame you. Most public school systems don't linger on them much, which is tragic. Alexie's writings are interesting because many occupy the space between the before and after of these schools. If you're like me and you have some moral hang-ups about putting money in Alexie's pocket, his story Indian Education is free to read online. Also, remember that you can always buy books secondhand, thereby not supporting the author directly. Indian Education is part of Alexie's larger short story collection called The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. The story is prefaced by a short autobiography, which suggests that there are many autobiographical elements to the story itself. The story concerns Native American identities as natives and as Americans. Particularly, Alexie explores the way American education added to or detracted from his identity, whether through a boarding school or through the same public education system that white children attended. To me, it is genuinely a thought-provoking read. Of course, if you'd rather not read any Alexie at all, there are plenty of other authors who explore the Indigenous relationship with American education. One of the most impressive among these, in my opinion, is Zitkala-Ša. A Lakota writer whose name means red bird, Zitkala-Ša was sent to the Indiana Manual Labor Institute in 1884 at just 8 years old. In her book, American Indian Stories, she shares many of her experiences throughout the education system. She places a great emphasis on the moments when her identity as a Lakota woman was challenged. For example, when taking public transportation to get to the boarding school, Zitkala-Ša describes how the palefaces, both adults and their children, pointed at and mocked her moccasins and blanket. One of the most striking scenes in her story is when she and several other Native children have their hair cut by the boarding school's teachers. Zitkala-Ša's work dissects the harsh dichotomy that many Native peoples have to live by, particularly those who leave their reservations and obtain education elsewhere. Despite the assimilation Zitkala-Ša was forced through by the palefaces, she would never be pale enough for them. On the other hand, that assimilation made it impossible to fit in with her tribe anymore. As she found greater success as a writer, she thought she might receive approval, either from her white peers or from her fellow tribesmen, but even her own family treated her as a stranger after what the palefaces had done to her. As such, Zitkala-Sha's work is a heartbreaking but, in my mind, necessary read, and while her nonfiction is a marvel, her fiction works shouldn't be counted out either. But perhaps you're looking for more contemporary Native American fiction. One of the first authors who comes to my mind is Rebecca Roanhorse. As a girl, Roanhorse was adopted by white parents. Through her birth certificate, she learned of her Okeowinga Pueblo heritage on her mother's side. Notably, some Native Americans, including those of the Okeowinga Pueblo, find it unethical for Roanhorse to be claiming Okeowinga and using this identity to publish Native stories, to quote Dr. Matthew Martinez, former lieutenant governor of the Pueblo. The controversy stems from the fact that Roanhorse is not enrolled as a citizen of the Okeowinga Pueblo and is, to quote Martinez, not engaging in any form of cultural and community acknowledgement. If you are Native American, I would love to hear your thoughts on this matter. Still, most readers can recognize how Roanhorse's Native identity contributed to her writing and life experiences, even if not a citizen of any Native nation. A good place to begin when it comes to Roanhorse would be her story, Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience, TM. The 2017 story has some sci-fi horror elements and, like Alexie's and Zitkala-Sha's works, delves into Native identity in a post-colonization America. In fact, Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience, TM, is prefaced with a quote from Alexie, reading, "In the great American Indian novel, when it is finally written, all of the white people will be Indians, and all of the Indians will be ghosts." Roanhorse's story also concerns the portrayal of Native Americans in media. The story takes place in a not-so-distant future where the main character essentially acts as a tour guide in VR spaces. Not to spoil too many of the themes in Roanhorse's story, but the work is reminiscent of the 2009 documentary, Real Injun, made by Cree filmmaker Neil Diamond. The film dissects the various modes of coding Native Americans on film, the noble savage, the ignoble savage, the drunk, etc. Diamond examines how Native Americans came to be more of props than they were characters, with many Native characters portrayed on-screen by white actors. Other Americans began to perceive real Native Americans as inauthentic because they didn't match their many on-screen images. Through media portrayals, white viewers no longer perceived Native Americans as Americans, assuming they even viewed Indigenous people as humans at all. Roanhorse's story and Diamond's film remind me of something my Native American studies professor said. Indian images are more about non-natives than about actual Native people. In his essay, Why Indians Love the Movies So Much, author and curator of the National Museum of the American Indian, Paul Chatt-Smith, wrote, "For Indian filmmakers today, there is no task more urgent than reclaiming a tradition of invention and storytelling by any means necessary. An intense desire to be on the world stage, and an unshakable demand not simply to star or even produce, but to write and direct our own stories and visions." If you love contemporary fiction, Rebecca Roanhorse is without a doubt worth adding to your reading list. Another contemporary author that ought to be on everyone's list is Louise Erdrich. A Chippewa author, Erdrich has written fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and children's books. The text that introduced me to Erdrich was this poem called Captivity. To understand this text to its fullest effect, we need to understand the genre of captivity narratives and the story of Mary Rowlandson. Captivity narratives are sort of exactly what they sound like. They were an extremely popular genre from the 1600s to the 1800s, when they almost exclusively centered around the true experiences of American colonizers who were taken captive by indigenous peoples who were fighting for their lives and lands. As such, these narratives almost entirely focused on Puritan faith in the face of capture. Mary Rowlandson's book, with its mouthful of a title, A Narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, is perhaps the quintessential captivity narrative. It's peppered with Bible verses throughout. It's a metaphor for how the soul is trapped within the body because of man's original sin. However, the work's focus is not simply the larger divine picture, nor the questions of self and survival. The narrative supports the colonizers' efforts to take America from its native peoples. Rowlandson depicts Native Americans with, in her words, savageness and as barbarous creatures. The narrative serves as a license of sorts. As such, while we look at the narrative with instinctive repulsion today, the book was a bestseller in its time, also due to the morbid curiosity other Puritans would invest in the story's premise. Its othering language made it easy for white readers to engage without any honest reflection. One person from whom you'd expect self-reflection is Rowlandson, and yet even she seems incapable. Rowlandson's humanity as a true individual, not as an allegory, is kind of lost in her telling of events. This is where Erdrich starts to rear her head as a modern reader. See, even though Rowlandson's captivity might be a true account, a reader has to wonder how honest it truly is. For example, a question that everyone had and still has about the narrative since its publication was, did Rowlandson have sex with a Native American? By her own account, the answer is no. As Rowlandson wrote, "Not one of them ever offered me the least abuse of unchastity to me, in word or action." Of course, she had every reason in the world to lie. As the book Regeneration Through Violence by Richard Slotkin asserts of Puritans during the time, to partake of the Indian's love or of his equivalent of bread and wine was to debase, to un-English, the very soul. And to her credit, Rowlandson knew people would think she was lying, even as she swore by God that she was telling the truth. Still, the honest premise of Rowlandson's narrative remains in question. Louise Erdrich then gives a more nuanced view of the captivity narrative that Rowlandson was incapable of giving. Erdrich opens her poem with a quote from Rowlandson and makes specific allusions to her book throughout. Allow me to read through it, then we can look at some of the finer details. "He, my captor, gave me a biscuit, which I put in my pocket, and not daring to eat it, buried it under a log, fearing he had put something in it to make me love him." From the narrative of the captivity of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, who was taken prisoner by the Wampanoag when Lancaster, Massachusetts was destroyed in the year 1676. "The stream was swift and so cold I thought I would be sliced in two, but he dragged me from the flood by the ends of my hair. I had grown to recognize his face. I could distinguish it from the others. There were times I feared I understood his language, which was not human, and I knelt to pray for strength. We were pursued by God's agents, or pitch devils, I did not know, only that we must march. Their guns were loaded with swan shot. I could not suckle, and my child's wail put them in danger. He had a woman, with teeth black and glittering. She fed the child milk of acorns. The forest closed, the light deepened. I told myself that I would starve before I took food from his hands, but I did not starve. One night he killed a deer with a young one in her, and gave me to eat of the fawn. It was so tender, the bones like the stems of flowers, that I followed where he took me. The night was thick. He cut the cord that bound me to the tree. After that the birds mocked, shadows gaped and roared, and the trees flung down their sharpened lashes. He did not notice God's wrath. God blasted fire from half-buried stumps. I hid my face in my dress, fearing he would burn us all, but this too passed. Rescued, I see no truth in things. My husband drives a thick wedge through the earth, still it shuts to him year after year. My child is fed of the first wheat. I lay myself to sleep on a Holland-laced pillow bier. I lay to sleep, and in the dark I see myself, as I was outside their circle. They knelt on deerskins, some with sticks, and he led his company in the noise, until I could no longer bear the thought of how I was. I stripped a branch and struck the earth, in time begging it to open, to admit me as he was, and feed me honey from the rock. There's a lot to unpack here, and unfortunately I can't hit it all, but let's start here. If it wasn't clear, Erdrich's poem is operating under the assumption that Rowlandson did indeed have sex with a Native American. That being said, it's still possible to read the text without that interpretation, but the evidence is just too strong for me. Look at the end of the third stanza and the start of the fourth stanza. Erdrich, from Rowlandson's perspective, says, "He cut the cord that bound me to the tree." Now, why would he do that? The blank space between these two stanzas is doing a lot of talking without really saying anything. Because look at what happens after Rowlandson was released from her cords. The birds mocked, shadows gaped and roared, and the trees flung down their sharpened lashes. Lashes is such an interesting term, evoking the idea of punishment, and in the next line Erdrich literally uses the term God's wrath. Ergo, Rolandson expects a punishment from God, a punishment that does not come to her captor. Interesting, no? Besides the blank space between stanzas 3 and 4, there are plenty of other innuendos here, like the idea of hunger, for example. In literature, consumption is always more than just eating. Rolandson accepted more than just the food, even though she tried to deny herself. She clearly wanted it despite denying it. And speaking of food, the poem's last line, "Feed me honey from the rock," is an allusion to a hymn praising God. Rolandson quotes the exact same line in her narrative. The imagery is reminiscent of when Moses drew water from a rock in the desert. However, it's clear that Erdrich's usage of the term is ironic and probably laced with innuendo. Look at the 5th stanza for a moment and let your mind run just a little bit wild when Erdrich describes the following visual. "My husband drives a thick wedge through the earth, still it shuts to him year after year." Think about these visuals of men driving sticks into the earth to try and draw out honey. The dual meaning should be pretty obvious. The visual suggests that perhaps Rolandson's native lover was better or more giving than her Puritan husband. However, the narrator isn't just talking about satisfaction with her husband, but also identity, as a lover, as a Christian, and as a mother. If the narrator felt more satisfied with a Native American than with her Puritan husband, what does that say about her? Moreover, how does that clash with the narrator's ideal of herself as a mother? The deer referenced in stanza 3 is pregnant, so what does it say about the Native American's transgressive choice to devour that deer? What does it say about the narrator when she makes the same choice? And notice that the deer almost seems more beautiful after the captor has dealt with it. It became tender, and its bones like flowers. I would wager this deer is a symbol of the narrator herself. Also, notice Rolandson's relationship with the other woman in this poem, the woman in stanza 2, the other lover of the Native American. This woman feeds her child milk of acorns. Compare this to the fact that Rolandson cannot breastfeed, and her child seems to be crying often. There's a sense of insecurity here in the narrator's motherhood, specifically insecurity in Rolandson's ability to provide for her child the way the native mothers could. Think about that idea on a broader scale. What might Erdrich be saying about Indigenous parents versus Anglo parents? As for religious identity, consider whether or not Rolandson truly was punished for her sexual transgression. Her captor didn't see any punishment, and if her captor didn't see it, was it even real? And if it wasn't real, what does that say about Rolandson's belief in God? What does that say about her entire life as a Puritan? These questions help us contextualize the narrator's inner monologue when she says, "And in the dark I see myself as I was outside their circle, until I could no longer bear the thought of how I was." I would love to hear more thoughts on this poem. If you have any, please fire them off in the comments below. But that's going to take us to the last author I want to discuss for today, Leslie Marmon Silko. As a first-wave writer in the Native American Renaissance, Silko is notable for taking traditions and legends from her Laguna Pueblo ancestry and translating them into English. A great portion of Silko's work is dedicated to the nature and language of storytelling. One of her collections is literally called Storyteller, for crying out loud. Silko often draws attention to the fact that Native American tales were told orally, and spoken stories change and change and change. In her story Lullaby, for example, Silko includes a written lullaby, which is an actual native song, not just something Silko invented for the story. However, the version written in the story is the version Silko herself heard. Not all versions are the same, and Silko knew that when writing it. The story explores language as an agent of betrayal and recovery. The story's main character, Aya, refuses to learn English, which is read as a stance to reject the other. The only English she knows is her name, and the ability to sign it ends up betraying her as well. Quote, "It was like the old ones always told her about learning their language or any of their ways. It endangered you." So what does that say about Silko's decision to write the story in English? What does that say about her choice to include a native lullaby in English? Is that a betrayal? Beyond language, we have other story elements being deconstructed here, such as temporality. The story is told in a very non-linear fashion, in part due to Aya's fleeting memories. The end of the story is presented in the beginning, and the things Aya is able to remember reveal so much about herself, her family, and her people. In the same way that time is conflated throughout the story, so is the story's main symbol, a blanket sent to Aya by her son, Jimmy. Aya makes it clear that Jimmy is her son's English name, and his real name is never revealed. So on one hand, the blanket represents Jimmy. However, at other times, the blanket is the wool that Aya's mother fashioned. At another time, it's the war, and more broadly, the Western culture that took Jimmy away and killed him. When Jimmy does die in the war, the military offers to return his body to Aya and her husband, Cheto, but they refuse. They have no need for the body as they don't believe in white traditions of burial. The military men are notably confused by the fact that Jimmy's parents wouldn't want his body, but all of this refers back to the titular lullaby. The earth is your mother, she holds you. The sky is your father, he protects you. Sleep, sleep. Rainbow is your sister, she loves you. The winds are your brothers, they sing to you. Sleep, sleep. We are together always. We are together always. There never was a time when this was not so. Each feature in the narrative forces us to consider the plot of the story versus the purpose of the story. So, I encourage you to read this story and try and decipher its purpose. Be warned, it is a heartbreaking story. In fact, so much literature from Native American authors is heartbreaking. So, what do we do about that? In her poem, Ceremony, Silko wrote, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment, don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories, but the stories cannot be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy because we would be defenseless then. The only way to one day achieve happier stories is to ensure we don't forget the stories we have now. And that's not just true of Native American literature, but all literature. So, do not forget. Do not let these stories be lost like the stories of old. Don't let anyone destroy these stories like the stories of old." I want to issue an assignment, as it were, at the close of this video. I want to encourage all of you to find a Native American author and read one of their works. Let that work lead you to another work. Let that author lead you to another author. Diversify the body of works you've read, but for now just start with one work. It can be a poem, a short story, a memoir, or a whole novel. And if you think it's worth sharing, do it. Share it in those comments down below. Until then, let me know what you thought of this video. Let me know which authors and works you're already familiar with. Let me and everyone else know which pieces we should check out. Tell me everything. And keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.